promises on which we're going to be here again today. This talk is pre-production of Lies We Tell, just to kind of give a little, framing for this. I come in a lot of stuff from the art side because I was an art director for a long time. The things that we're going to talk about in here are like abstract concepts also that you could apply to whatever your discipline is, whether it's design or music or any piece of it you could apply to. So it's not something that just because I'm framing it from an art direction perspective that there aren't takeaways that go across disciplines. Anyway, so like I said, I'm Greg Foertsch. For a lot of you know me, some of you don't. I'm preproducer at Bit Reactor. We're a relatively new studio within the last 4 years or so. So you may not have heard of us. We're up in the Valley. We're about 100 or so people. They announced that we were publishing deal with EA and Lucasfilm making a Star Wars game. Last April, we actually announced it. So a little plug for that. We're working with Star Wars Zerocompany. Feel free to go wishlist it would be great. But you can see more about that. This talk is not about the Spirit Company, but it's stuff that it does kind of affect a little bit that I've taken into this process. So I guess you're kind of wondering, what does this talk about? It's a little weird, talking about lies and that sort of thing, but it, kind of where did it come from? It's kind of accumulated over 18 years of art direction. If you're looking for pretty pictures and flashy cinematics this morning, you're probably in the wrong room. This is the first time I've done a talk like this that has like maybe 2 images in the whole thing. So anyway, if you're looking for that, that's the talk that we're doing here today. It's more about the process and pipelines and taking advantage of that early time development as opposed to just kind of flashy stuff. It's not what I'm here for today. I've actually done a couple talks that you find in the vault, I think, for free on XCOM and XCOM2. I largely reference that in here in that process of how we went about making pre-production movies, previous movies, about what we wanted to make and how each one of those processes was different. Like XCOM and Unknown was a very different process to XCOM2. Probably shouldn't have been, but they were. And so there's a lot of kind of looking back on that. I actually, having written this, somebody actually said to me that this is sort of like the third talk of the 3, and it kind of makes sense that I didn't approach it that way, but now when I look at it, it sort of is. So, an overview, kind of we're going to look at, again, production timelines, kind of what are they. Everybody kind of knows what they are, but we're kind of going to quickly. Defining pre-production process, exploring the phases within a pre-production process, and actually what are those? And kind of defining acceptance criteria for that. And then how do you exit pre-production? Has everybody's here made games. Has anybody ever had anybody tell you what is pre-production? It's just like this block of time that right? And Michelle's laughing, right? It's like there's just this, what is it, right? And I think one of the things that I kind of learned over time, I think, going into XCOM and Unknown, intuitively I knew that was really important, that we really try to maximize that time. But it was all kind of instinctual, having done it really nebulously for years. And it wasn't until the past couple of years that I think I've really been able to kind of put it all together. So anyway, projects, they always need 3 things, right? More time, more money, and more people, right? I think that in order to kind of avoid some of that, you're always going to want more of it, but the way that you take advantage of it is, the key is maximizing that pre-production space. How do I make sure that time is spent really well And it's really hard sometimes because I think that, you know, at the end of a project, you finish a project, for any of you who've been through a studio process, you finish a project and you go up to make it and you're killing yourself. Like you're working 80 hours because that date's not moving and that's just what it is and it sucks. But like you come down. You don't come down and just go straight, right? There's a dip. For anybody that is interested, there's a really good book called Slack that talks about that wavelength, right? And your job as a developer, and especially if you're a manager, is to try to keep that wavelength like this, right? There's going to be ups, but you got to understand, like, okay, now my people are going to crash. They need some time to dip out of this to get back up on the right trajectory. So for every up that you ask people to do, there's that. It doesn't come and just go straight, right? And I think a lot of the times in my career, I was always on the back end of development, finishing the product, doing an expansion, things like that. So as I got into another project, I was expected to hit and just keep moving. It's just not realistic. And so the way to avoid that, I think, in my head, is trying to maximize those wavelengths early so that you don't get that up and that you're always trying to kind of just keep it this way. So to that end, one of the few pictures in the slide, in the deck, it was early in production on actually this game that I'm working on now, and I was sitting there, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and the Olympics were on, and I was sort of in a place where I was like just zoned out because I was tired of starting a business, getting the project off the ground, you know, oh my God, running up the first day, right? I'm feeling that way. So I'm sitting there watching the modest stuff. I'm in my basement with just the TV on, if you picture it, my dog sitting next to me, and petting the dog. And I'm just like, all of a sudden I realize, I'm like, these guys are doing this mono sled, and they're running, and then they get their sled, and they go down the sled, and they quit slide, and then they have their time. The race wasn't won in the actual sled. The race was won in their split running up to when they get in the sled. So I started looking at that as like a really good kind of way to think about pre-pro, even though it can be a little bit blue sky and what is this, but like you've got to be running as fast as you can run in that beginning so that the slide down is easy. Now, the part about that that also gets a little tricky is, now imagine if it's a bobsled and you've got 4 men, and it's 4 of you running, and all 4 of you have to be running as hard as you can run, because you can't drag one of them. So like, thinking about how you take advantage of the pre-pro, I don't know, to me it just dawned on me as I was watching the Olympics, I was like, this is game development. Anyway, so that's kind of a little bit of what has led to some of this. Production timelines, again, I think, you know, as you look at these things, there are these, for me, they break up into these 4 sections. They're not equal in length. There's ideation, there's pre-production, there's production, and then post. And when you look at that, these are a lot of the things that sort of happen inside of those buckets, and it's not, again, not prescriptive. This is not necessarily all the things that everybody encounters, but a lot of these things sort of happen in these areas for the most part. So you've got, you know, ideation is that really early stage, it's high concept. And then the pre-production, and then when you get into production, that's when you're doing, you know, the bulk of the actual creation of the art of the game. But it's that first 2 that are really important. And so I'm going to kind of focus as much as I can today on those 2 in particular. So when you look at this real quickly, it's sort of like, I like to think of this sort of as the open phase. Like this is where you're open to new ideas, you're kind of iterating on things, you're thinking through it, you're open to possibilities. But you're aware that like, it's got to end at a certain point. It needs to have an end, it needs to close. So most of the ideation is happening is I open space, where you can formulate ideas, you can throw things out there, you can try things, but you've got to have it end. I think one of the things that gets you into trouble in development sometimes is there's no gate, there's no close. Where you close that open space and you evaluate what you came up with in the open phase of it and say, is this good, does this work, can we proceed? But if you never put a cap on that open space, on that open phase of it, you basically can run on for years. I mean, left to my own devices, I'd stay in pre-production cover, right? I think all of us would. But you've got to have that point where you sort of shut the door and say, what do I have? Is it good? Do I need to go back and rethink it, or can I proceed forward? You've got to have that forcing function of some point in time where you make a decision. So how do you define pre-production? I think it's important to really define the goals that you're going to have. What are those things that you're looking to kind of figure out, and make sure that you break it up in ways that's sort of bite-sized so that it's not nebulous, right? I think it's super important. When I was actually looking at pre-production, what is the definition of it? This is literally what Google gave me. And it's the stage when writers, artists, designers, developers collaborate to determine the scope of a game. That includes coming up with ideas for how the game will function. It's always easy, right? And its characters, its look, and its story. I mean, that's basically making the game, right? That's not that's a lot of the thing. So it's when you look at this, it's overwhelming. So how do you break it up? How do you make it in ways that people can sort of rock it and again have those sort of goalposts where, okay, evaluate it, does it work, move forward. If it doesn't, I think the big thing is make sure you can go back. But if you go too far along without kind of closing that gate, you don't know how far off you've drifted sometimes. I think the other thing that's important is honestly it's where the bulk of the work is though. It's done differently everywhere. I mean, I don't think that anybody necessarily does this the same. Again, when you ask people about it, it's sort of it's pre-production. I've taught, I've worked with a bunch of different developers from different studios. They all do it different. And maybe that's part of the problem. Like I said, it's the open phase, and that's where you're kind of doing the ideation, and there's this closed phase that when you get into production and post. I think it's also pretty important to kind of understand the difference between collaboration and committees. If you ever heard of design by committee phrase and what that is, I prefer design by collaboration, and what the difference there for me is that there is a decision maker. It doesn't mean that you're not listening to people around you, you're not hearing people that are on your team, that you're not writing or soliciting feedback. But at the end of the day, it's not a vote. A vote gets you a bunch of average. Nobody really wins. Nobody really gets the best answer. Everything kind of gets watered down in a lot of cases. And so I think in this phase of it, it's really important to have somebody that's clearly making these decisions and solidly. And I think it's also ends up kind of being a bit of it can also dangerously be a nebulous end into production, which is something else I'll dive into too. So where does it stop? It's not a clear understanding of when does pre-production end and when does production start. I think a lot of people will get from publishers and business types are you in production yet? Are you in production yet? Heard that a ton of times. And it doesn't really mean anything to have an answer all the questions up front. And it just makes people feel better. So trying to make sure that we've established, those clear understandings of where you're getting to in each phase of the development. So, where does production start? Like I said, go ahead.
a question about when you're going through pre-production, what is the correct level of detail that you should define your goals at, so that you're not changing your plan after you've already put all the work creating like an explicit plan? Like what's the right level of detail?
So I'm going to probably get more into that in a second, but like, you know, that's again, it's coming up with the intent, like in the ideation phase specifically, and I may be jumping ahead of myself here, but that's where you get your game pillars. What is the basic premise we're doing? That's generally a shorter period of time. So in this talk, I'm going to lump it together. Yeah, I'll get to a little more of that, but don't call me on it.
Okay.
But I think I'm going to get to some of that too. So anyway, you know, a lot of times you get people that are like, you know, is it a percentage of done, is it shippable quality? Who's heard those words? Shippable quality. I love shippable quality. I love visually complete. I'm an art director at heart. I can fake that all day, right? So like that's always been this sort of like, well, what is shippable quality? Oh, 80%. What does that look like, right? So I think they're different, and those are better, but I don't know what that means. Anyway, so yeah, I think it's really important you understand at the beginning that like closed phase, we're stopping and we're moving forward. So I think the easiest way that you can define that is just simply, can you fabricate? At the end of the day, do you have enough information to start making whatever part of the game, or the whole game, that is? And this may be different for each discipline. You maybe have, you know, again, I'm going to come at this from the art perspective. Characters may be ready to go, but animation's not, because they haven't really figured out exactly how they're going to reflect the animation based on the visual look of the game. So there's some things in there that get a little tricky, but again, at the end of the day, you know, you're moving toward this goal of, can you confidently say, yes, I can make more of this? So the pre-production phase, I think is what you were getting at before. Ideation, you know, that ends up being is pretty simple. It's blue sky. It's the high concept. It's about the gameplay. What do you want the gamer to feel? Usually this is a small group of people. This would typically be art director, creative director, lead designer, maybe producer, lead producer, in a room just kind of spitballing the general skeleton of what we want to make. And I think it's really important to kind of, you know, how do you support that mood and that feel in the game? You're gathering reference, you're looking at other games, you're looking at ideas that maybe cross outside of the genre, you're looking at that open up new spaces for the game you want to make, and things you're inspired by. You know, and I think it's important that in each one of these things, like, you know, it's not always the game director maybe that has the final say. Like, some of these things may get delegated to the art director or the lead designer or whatever to kind of come up with some of these answers. It's not necessarily it's easy to think that game development is a one person dictates how everything works. Again, while there's a decision maker, it's generally not, doesn't come down that way. Yeah.
I guess on that note, how would you define the differences in workflow and thought processing between creative direction and art direction as your background?
They get really slippery. I would say that I became a whole lot more interested in creative direction all the way along, like kind of throughout XCOM, both XCOM games. And I think where I didn't recognize was like, I was way more interested in like, what is the overall feel, like what is the overall player experience starting to be, what's that tree look like? Like I started to care, really, I could care less. Like, I don't care what that desk is like. Just show me a model, I'll pick one. And I don't think, on my own personal journey, that I was self-aware enough to understand that, like, wait a minute, I'm drifting away from the thing that I thought I was doing. And I'm starting to care more about this other thing. I want to do this other thing. And where I was at that point, I was basically at I didn't have another loan to get to inside the company I was in. And I also didn't have anybody around me that was like, hey, dude, you're drifting. Like, you clearly don't care about this anymore. And like, I don't even say I didn't care about it. I just cared less about it. It was like, yeah, I'm going to need a desk, right? Like, sure, like any one of those desks work, great. Like, I'm thinking about this other thing. And so, so I think they definitely get intertwined, and it's really hard sometimes to separate them. Even now, I have times where it's like, it's like I've got an art opinion about this thing, right? And it's I can't like get that part of me to sometimes go away. And I think some of it is just accepting that that's kind of like going to be a piece of it. I'm always going to come at it that way. I think just like creative directors that may be a designer are always going to come at it from a design perspective, always. And so it's just a little bit different flavor. But on the art direction side and creative direction, I think that those are really, they can be kind of messy in how they sort of lead over each other, right? It's like, because, with XCOM 1, like, honestly, the camera decisions were creative direction decisions, I would argue. The idea of dropping a camera in a tactical, squad-based, turn-based game was, nobody does that. What is this? And like, so they were, to me, that was probably the first steps where I started thinking about, like, what is the overall, like, player experience, and caring more about that and that presentation than just purely about, like, what's the style of the trees today? Like, I started to, and I think I also, honestly, getting deep therapy today. I started also, like, when I was asked those questions, I think it was hard for me to disguise that it was not a priority, right? Like, and maybe my artists were like, what's going on? Like, you just want me to answer it? And yeah, just answer it. Like, I'm good. Like, and that's also, I think, one of the things when you have a team that's been together for so long. There's a trust. Like, my team was largely a team that worked on railroads that I built all the way through. So we were together for 12 years. And so when it got to like, oh, what does the desk look like? I'm like, I trust you to tell me what the desk looks like. Go ahead. Like, what are you excited about, right? Because we had already kind of gotten to that point. So it's a messy space when you start drifting from the art direction to the creative direction. It's all sort of intertwined. And I think, again, when you look at the design perspective, sometimes it's a little more the same way with that, and that that design role, game director leading into creative direction also gets a little fuzzy sometimes. So it just depends on what your background is. Anyway. Where was I? Anyway, yeah, so I think the big thing here is like the gate that they kind of identifying the gates, like for me, the gate to going into the vision phase of this is that like the leadership of the team, like we all think that not only is are the visual references, but the gameplay references are all viable candidates to like proceed. And then you're ready to go into the next thing. And this may drag into that vision phase a little bit, like they tend to bleed a little bit. These two are very, very close to each other. And this is where like your intention is really kind of investigated, and you try to establish like a foothold of what this is. Oh yeah.
Sorry to go backwards. Could you go a little further on what defining visual questions means? On the last slide.
Okay, yeah. So I think some of that. So I think that's a good one. Is like, what's the style of the game? What's which is also And man, it's way less like subjective, like art director folly, like depending on the game you're making. It's like, to me, I think that the camera dictates art direction, right? So wherever you decide to put the camera, however I want to present the game, starts to now dictate to me how wide of an opening I have as an art director to say, I'm going to make a super stylized, chibi-headed game, right? Like so if I wanted to do something like that, I'd have to make sure that not only did the game direction support it, but also that the camera supported it, right? Like with XCOM 1, I think we started out with a much more realistic goal of making the characters and everything much more real. I think as we got through that, we started realizing that like those little details, especially with the tech at the time, didn't read very well. And it was hard to tell the difference between different kinds of characters and different kinds of weapons. So then that's where we kind of, internally we call it chunkifying, but everything got kind of chunkified and simplified so that you got better, easier silhouettes. And not to mention, I think the other part of that I worked into that was realizing also, for my team, we just weren't honestly ready to do that. Like we were biting off more than the team at the time could literally do. My team was largely a team I built for railroads that was essentially my interns over years that had turned into my team. And so I don't think that given the kinds of games we made before, that kind of holding up to that initial previs, and you can find this online, the initial XCOM previs, it's much more realistic, right? But like the art direction changed. I never went back, well I sort of did, but I never formally went back and did it. I actually did a second previs movie later in the process that had a much more chunked look involved, and it was out of engine. The first one we did was out of Max. And so that was one of those things where like I was also art directing to what I thought my team could accomplish successfully in the time that we had available, which is a tough one to take, right? Like, you know, it's like you want to believe that you can do anything, and I believe that team could do pretty much anything, but I also didn't want to set them up to fail. So the art direction on that game shifted based on the time that we had available and the personnel that we had, and making sure that we also were faithful to what the game needed too. So it was a combination of factors that all added into us shifting after that initial visualization movie. So
you might be good at this. How often does the game go from pre-production to production and then back to pre-production because of whatever?
without admitting it, lots.
And then how does that affect? That's the other question.
A lot of delays come from. I think that when you're also not honest about like, can I fabricate, right? That's a big one. And so like if you keep drifting without having that closed phase, you end up, you can kind of like roll off of it. I get into this later in the previs part of this, but like when we made that first XCOM previs, that was for anybody who was on the team. It was me and a bunch of artists. And then we got out of that, we got that greenlit by 2K. We went and made a prototype. And I think you can find the prototype online too. There's an article about that. It looks nothing like that previs. It's terrible, right? It was you were like hiding behind cows, and they were covered, and they would explode, and it was just really big. It was all these procedural elements, random elements, not procedural. There's a difference, and it just wasn't good. And so we took this thing to 2K, and they were like, "This doesn't match that thing that we talked about." And so thank God they were like, go make it like this thing you showed us. If we hadn't done that thing, we would have drifted into making a game that 50,000 people would have bought, and we would have been out of business. So like, I think the fact that we kind of held our toes to something that was engaging and people responded well to, instead of just something that was like this design exercise where we kind of just ignored it, they made us come back to it. I think that was it kept us from getting so far down that road that we looked at it really started over. I mean, we sort of started over, but it was not as bad as it could have been.
Thank you so much for doing this talk. Love XCOM likes. This is kind of a philosophical question, but do you ever get weird when you see a game that's literally like just XCOM with like different IP on it, where it's like, hey, it's XCOM with Mario, it's XCOM with Persona, it's XCOM with, and they literally just slap a new skin on it, and it's the same exact game 100%.
Well, I mean, honestly, most of them are not exact skins. Like Mario is different. It's got a very different approach, and it's got it shares some DNA. But for me, I get excited by it, and it just shows the possibility in that space. I mean, I firmly believe that squad-based tactical games are like turn-based games in that space to me have the most room to iterate and improve. Like the biggest argument I have, and anybody who knows me has heard me say this before, get a little fired up about it, is that like, why do we think that strategy games should look worse than any other game out there? Like, we take the camera away from you every other turn. We should be able to tell better stories because of that, right? Like, we don't have latency issues. We're turn-based, right? And so, like, why wouldn't you have better looking art? Like, it makes no sense. Why wouldn't I have better looking or more immersive stories? Because again, I can stop the game at any point I want and inject some level of immersion in that sense. Like, where we got off on like strategy games should look like cheap and they're just mobile and they should be $3 is beyond me, because to me, that is the one genre that still has the most room to actually move. So anyway, yeah, everybody knows I'm on my soapbox again. So yeah.
Have you ever been in a spot where you realize that pre-production was going like way off the rails and you had to like maybe bring it in, or I don't know if you're getting to that point.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think that's the thing. Like the XCOM EU pre-pro was honestly like how it should be done. XCOM 2 was awful. Like, it was not good. And like, we threw out everything we learned and we just started. We didn't go through the ideation phase. We didn't do the previs phase correctly. We didn't do any of that work. We just started. Part of it was that we had a whole team at that point that kind of got put on us. And so you got, 60 people that you got to get work for, and you kind of start taking shortcuts. That ends up, you end up doing a lot of rework, and you've got a lot of people staring at you like, hey man, what's the answer to this? What are we doing? What does that desk look like? And I'm like, I don't care. Right? Like, it's that sort of thing going on. Whereas, with EU, we started 10 months before I even had somebody on the project. Jake and I started talking about what was this game going to be? What were we going to pitch? And it was literally just us never making anything, just sitting there talking for 8 to 10 months before we had our first person actually build a project. And so it was every day, we just kind of chat, what do we want to do? Like, don't want to start in Geoscape, that's terrible, it's a bad experience, it was great in 94, bad now. But also looking at those games, looking at what we're doing, that in particular was looking at that game with reverence, like, this is one of the best games ever made. Are the design ideas and the choices the way they are because of the tech at the time, or because maybe they were just the best choice. And so trying to also filter through all that in that process. But we did the ideation phase for 8-10 months, where it was just 2 people in a room talking. And then we rolled on a little bit of concept, and then we started moving. So it was a very small, we did it right there, and then the other one we just kind of didn't. So I've seen it go where you have to kind of come back, and you're always, you can never get up from underneath the ball, right? You're always trying to like get in front. You just can't. It's too much moving.
unless you're building multiple roles, in which case you throw away the entire code base and harvest the supply 3 times before you build the final product.
Exactly.
Because we hired 150 people in 18 months to start that project.
And that is also just generally a bad recipe is like that, again, that communication you got with that team where you speak the same language, the cost of the new voices and the new perspectives and the new expectations and new vocabulary, new understandings of what does it mean to make something. It's intense and it is really, really hard. And if if you don't have Bethesda backing you sometimes, it's, the cost of doing that is
Shutting down.
And again, we probably should work to be better at not doing things like that. So, but yeah, it does get really complicated when you staff up like that too. That can be big.
Building off of that, like I'm from the junior mindset, how do I come into a ecosystem that has a bunch of established people that know a lot of things and work well together, and come in and help learn to be a part of that and help work with it instead of taking so much resources to try to teach me different things or to disrupt that ecosystem? Or is that even the mindset you should go in?
I mean, I think you go in there, when you join the team, it's like, I started as an intern. Next thing I had interns, it's like, how did this happen? I was like, I'm the guy who's getting yelled at all the time. How am I the guy that's not got guys? I think just come in and worry about, doing the thing in front of you each day when you're new and talking to, and I think this is one of the things that, remote damages to some degree is, I felt like I was able to wander around and make friends with designers and programmers and get to know them and other people to kind of understand how the game got put together, not my just little piece of it. And without having done that, I don't think I'd be doing the things I'm doing now without having had that education. So trying to figure out who the people are that you can learn from, try to stay a little bit out of their way. But if you're getting your stuff done every day and moving forward, and just ship a product, right? Shipping a product is super important because the things that happen at the end of the game, there's no other way to experience it than just shipping.
So I have a question. Feel free to just say we'll talk later because I want to follow up on Logan's question from the other side. If you have a well-established process that works and you're bringing somebody else into the fold, what are the right kinds of onboarding materials and processes that you can put in place?
Well, I think that's kind of the stuff is you end up basically create, you end up creating your intention docs, you've got your pillars, you've got all those things. Our deck for this game is essentially my pitch deck, right? And from there, once we pitched it, from there I was able to look at what was the actual content in the actual deck and derive the pillars. So we've got 4 pillars that have been there since day one. And if we want to change any of those, if at any point we go through this stage and we're like, man, it's not a tactics game, maybe we have to go back and change those pillars and then repitch them, which is also the scary part. But I think the good thing about that is once you have those in place, they apply to everyone. Even me, I can't go in and be like, you know what, I'm going to make a shooter today. I can't do that because I'm violating those pillars. So once you stand those up, and those are tremendously important for everybody to understand what the game is, and making sure that document gets shared frequently. I've got a few of my producers at work that actually have that page with the pillars as their desktop background. And again, these are the things that have been there since day one. They haven't changed. So if that answers your question, I think that's one of the better ways to kind of do that.
A part of it, yeah. I could follow up. So what I'm also thinking is if there's a production process that you're in, helping them understand what's been done and where they're coming in and where it's going. But then feel free to just.
Yeah, hopefully if you have enough established that you can kind of jump somebody through that process.
Yeah.
It's hard if it's kind of nebulous and you don't have any sort of guides at all. And people get left to whatever process they want to do. It's kind of enforcing those things and making sure that you're clear about them and you set those expectations with everybody out of the gate. Yeah. So, but anyway, I'll try. If I don't answer that more, I'll be back. So anyway, all right, so moving through this, sorry, a little jumbled on this one. But anyway, I think early on in that vision phase 2, I think this is where you'll notice, and it doesn't matter what the names are here necessarily, and your mileage may vary. You may have, 3 people here and not, everybody. But it's to notice that it's flat, it's horizontal, it's not vertical. In this case, you as the art director in this case are the lead. You don't have leads because there's nothing to lead. And I think that was one of those things too that I think moving off of an established project onto another project, we've got all these people and getting it started in pre-production is like, well, what do you do with people who are leads? Like they don't want to have a promotion. It's like, but I don't need leads right now. You're still a lead, you're not leading anyone. Because right now that flat layer are the hands, and you could apply this to a game director or game designer as well. That you need your hands that are helping you establish those guidelines and that vision so that then you can have leads that propagate that out to everybody. But until then, it's like going backwards and flattening that structure. That sometimes gets really tricky, especially if you're going from a project that's finishing to another one. Style guides and art bibles, I think like in that vision phase, you're not doing art bibles. I think like I was asked, and part of the impetus for actually making this talk largely was we finished XCOM2, we were starting to make Midnight Suns, and 3 weeks into that cycle, I was asked, where was my art bible? I was like, what are you talking about? Like, you don't make those then. 3 weeks in, you have no idea what the game is, let alone how you fabricate the parts of it. So it kind of led me more to this idea of like, what you really are gathering at this point are style guides. You've got, people going off and figuring out what, characters are, what animation is, what environments look like, what UI looks like. And again, the same thing can apply to other aspects of development. But it's more of an intention doc, right? You're really trying to, what do I think I'm making? And it's broken up in ways that's digestible, and it's still something that you intend to mold. There's no way through each of the project you know what the triangle count for characters will be. That's the dumbest thing in the world, right? But I've seen a lot of people be asked that. Kind of gathering style guides is really important, and understanding that stuff should be something that's flexible, and it may cause you to go back and talk about the ideation phase a little bit, but hopefully they're reinforcing what we've discussed in that ideation phase. You're also coming up with actually more of a game pitch here. Like this is the stuff that you're going to take to a publisher, you're going to take forward, you're going to show it to the team, you've got your pillars established. The game gets greenlit hopefully at this point. And I think the big thing here is that you want to make sure you've got enough visual pieces figured out that you can move into that next phase, which is that pre-visualization that I kind of get into pretty heavily. This is actually my favorite part. My favorite part is not the blue sky piece, which I think probably a lot of people think it is. It's not. This is actually a screenshot of the whiteboard at Firaxis. During the ideation phase of this, I went up on the whiteboard, and this is my chicken scratch drawing. And I basically mapped out what a previs would look like. So I knew I was going to get a handful of artists to help me. And so I was making sure that when they hit the ground running. So we had everything boarded out. We took over a conference room. It was only that room, so we kept that circle tight with the communication so I wasn't getting hit with pellets. And generally that's how I like to work. I tend to to kind of close down for a little bit so I can figure out exactly what I'm trying to say. And then as soon as I have that, then I open it up to everybody. But in that, if you open it up too early, some of the feedback can sometimes spin you out. And so in this case, we moved everybody to a conference room. We had brand new computers to start that could handle Unreal, because we hadn't had Unreal before. And we hadn't been working like this before, and we wanted to make sure everybody communicated the same way. So we locked everybody in this conference room and started on this. The blue boards are actually the gameplay questions that we have. Like, how are we going to show three-quarter view? How are we going to show floor transitions? What do those look like? And then some of the red ones tended to be more of immersion opportunities, cinematic opportunities. But even in the blue ones, you can see how we start to challenge some of the ideas. One of the games feel really claustrophobic, right? And so when you went into a space, one of the things that the movie does and that we did here was like the camera gets a little bit tighter because you can't see past the walls anyway. Lots of little stuff like that we were trying to mess around with. And then as we did this, bring the designer in and say, can I play from this view? Like, we had it all set up in Max, and we were like, can we play from here? And he'd be like, no. I was like, what about here? He's like, yeah. And so we started to arrive at like what that language, the camera language would be, before we had an ounce of code. And then we went from here, we rendered this thing out in Max and made the previews for it. It's really important that you think of this as like an idealized presentation. This is gameplay, and you might be wondering, like, well, what does everybody else do while the artists are working on this? Hopefully, you've got enough things that like the engineers are starting to work toward tooling and things that they're moving on. Designers might be thinking about abilities, that sort of thing, depending on who your team is. But like, you're moving toward this idealized presentation of gameplay. The number of times that people want to turn this into a sizzle reel, it's not. You can't. And the most important thing too is that you're trying to really address design mechanics that like, what happens here? How does this work? The one thing in the previous for XCOM 1 was the floor transitions are actually like, we didn't know. We got that open lead. I'm like, crap, how do I go second floor? And so rather than solve it, it raised that question. We put a fork in it. We're like, we need to solve this immediately, but we're not going to stop our momentum. We're just going to keep moving. But we know we got to come back to that. The very next thing we did, as soon as we finished that movie, concept work went immediately into how do we handle floor transitions. And what we came up with, that little blue outline and how we did it, it's pretty much exactly what that decision was that day. But if we kick that can down the road, and it kind of goes back to your question, you kick that can down the road of like, I don't know what happens when this works like this. And then it turns into a real problem because you've hand-waved it for way too long. And, you know, then you just have to pay for it. But if you kind of know it, then you can attack it head-on and try to deal with the hardest design problems. We had the largest alien versus the smallest alien because I needed to make sure they were readable. So we made the Sectopod, who didn't look like that in the shipping game, but was the same height. And so we knew that it would fit on the camera the way that we were doing it. So trying to make sure you're hitting the least ideal situations sometimes in this process. And again, you're developing your pipelines. Did one for Midnight Suns, which arguably was probably the most successful one of these I did. And we came out of that with our outsourcing vendors, our outsourcing pipelines, our character pipelines, our music vendors, UI, all of it. Like, we walked out of it with like all these things, sort of like we hit the point where we answered like all these different ideas. And so, you know, you're just trying to get as close as you can get to a real game experience. So again, you can keep pointing back to that thing. The one thing about making these movies is that they, you can't get people to read the design doc all the time. You can't get them to read an archival. But you sure can get people to watch a 3-minute video. And the number of times that I've had engineers watch the movie and come back and be like, what you did there? I'm like, okay, cool. And with XCOM 2, we did Overwatch in a very different way. And I wasn't sure we were going to do it in the game that way. And a year and a half later, my lead program comes and was like, hey, you know, I've been working on this thing at home. I have Overwatch that looks like your movie. And I was like, what? Like, I kind of decided I wasn't going to get that. And so, you know, he's like, no, I've been referencing that the whole time. So, like, there are benefits that kind of come out of those things. And again, all those assets should really move into the next phase, which is when you move into a prototype. So, and then when you move that prototype, your pipeline should all be ready to like test. Like, what's my animation pipeline? What's my effects pipeline? What's my character pipeline? You've thought through all these things. So then, prototype, this is the big one. This is where art, design, and engineering all converge. You know, we did that on this current game as well while we were working on it. On our previous for this game, the engineers were all getting ready to switch to Unreal 5 and building all the tooling that we needed and things that we were looking for just to get the game going. So as soon as we finished the previs, we merged in Unreal 5 and all started going toward a prototype. And at this point, this is what your team is starting to look like. They go vertical instead of a horizontal. And so in the production phase, prototype phase, you know, this is where your style guides continue to get refined. You may have to go back a little bit to ideation sometimes and what does that look like? What are we doing? But like you recognize it, you go back, you fix it. And so you're moving to a more accurate answer of is this ready for production? And then, you know, your vertical slice here, it needs to adhere to that visualization like I talked about before. And then at this point, if you've done all those things, your game is in a really good place to greenlit. Your publisher understands where you are. And then the production task of like, we need n number of characters, we need n number of films, we need n number of environments, can start kind of propagating out. And the thing about kind of looking at it like this is you can always go back and do this on a much smaller scale too. It could be, you know, you take this whole idea process through a feature of the game that comes online halfway through, but you know, and just kind of go through it in those sort of cases. You're more predictable when you're going to get something that works. So, and then at this point, yes, you can enter production because you can fabricate, you know how to make all these things. You can actually schedule them out, and you have a bit more of an accurate idea when you're actually going to be done instead of guessing at it. So, I think the other thing too about when you get into that, where can it go wrong? I think where it could go wrong, again, is if you kick the can, you don't kind of address those early design questions. This is not just purely a visual thing. You're trying to reconcile all that stuff. If you ignore that stuff, it can go wrong. I think, you know, treating production, entering production as like a single line that everybody crosses together, it's much more like a race. And trying to make sure that like you're building out that production answer differently is really important. Because I think the first time that your producers live your team is when they tell them that we're in production on Friday. And the VFX guys are like, we're nowhere near that. What are you talking about? This is stupid, I don't believe you. Right? And it's like, only a portion of the team can say that. So I think trying to make sure that when you build that production schedule, when you say you can enter production, you can fabricate, you're being realistic about it so that people understand like, okay, these words mean something, those dates mean something, and it's not just arbitrary, and they don't see me. I think is really important. So, any questions? Go ahead.
How do you prevent the visualization from becoming too much of a ball and chain that as you're making the game, you better understand what game you're making that may conflict with, may not conflict with the builders, but conflict with the
If it does, you go back and you take that portion and go back, and hopefully you can surgically do it. Go back into ideation, go back into the reference, go back into like you don't have to necessarily make previs, but like you may have to go back and hit some of those things to think through that piece, but you can be surgical about it, is what I'm trying to say, make sure that you kind of, but yeah, because the game will shift, like the game speaks to you, every game does, they fight back. So,
Two questions. First one, if you're a small team, you have a bunch of people out there, a bunch of people.
oh yeah, it can scale.
How do you sort of like know, oh, I really need this bare bones team? That's part one. Then part two is, what are your best advice for documenting your process? So that, I think you mentioned XCOM2, you threw it all the way and started, then you shouldn't have. So how do you sort of make sure that you documented
I should have documented the first one. I mean, I did. I mean, this is all like kind of looking back. This is all like hindsight. Like, wow, that was dumb, right? And so I kind of have been going through that. I think it's really good when you. I would say for everybody when you do a project, no matter how big or small it is, you should do a GDC talk. Even if you're not going to do one, you should write one because it's a great way to kind of postmortem what you've been through and come back to it. It wasn't to like, you know, I didn't really come to this talk until like, I was asked where my archival was 3 weeks into the project. I was like, what are you talking about? And I realized that I needed to kind of come up with a more formal understanding of what you should expect here. And so that's kind of where the whole talk came from. But,
and small teams.
The small teams, I mean, it's all can scale, and it's all about like the people you generally want in that initial like ideation room are your problem solvers and the people you probably trust and communicate with the best. To try and like again to wrap your head around something, and then you can start opening that up to more people depending on the size of your team. But yeah, it's scalable. It's, you know, depends on how many people you have. If it's just 3 people, that's a little different. But yeah, it's scalable.